Hi everyone. So we've been told for over 2.5 years now that the Russians tried to interfere in American democracy, which is really, really bad. And Russiagate has been huge for the last 2.5 years. It's really all the mainstream media have talked about in that time. So you would think that they would come out against Donald Trump tweeting out a coup, presumably whilst he was on the toilet. But no, they've all come out actually in favour of it by the look of it, and so have many Democrats. Now, here to talk about this with me is the great journalist from The Real News, Ben Norton. Hi, Ben. How are you?
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much for coming on. It really is an honour. Thank you very much. So what I want to talk about is, I know from my time researching Iran and the history of Iran versus America that it isn't as simple as just going back to the JCPOA. It isn't as simple as just going back to 9/11. It isn't as simple as just going back to 1979, which is the furthest they will ever go back. I think Reuters once went back to 1979, which I was astounded by. No, it all started much further back. It started actually in 48 and then 53. And you need to go back in history to actually get the full picture of these conflicts. So what I want you to do, if possible, Ben, if you don't mind, and that's just give us an overview of the history of the relationship between Venezuela and America, and what has actually led us to this point where seemingly the President of the United States can just declare somebody else the leader of a democratically led country by tweet.
Yeah, I'm very glad you said that, because one of the points that I've been stressing in many of my interviews, many of my discussions, is that one of the ways that the corporate media distorts the way we understand contemporary political events is by situating them in this context as if history doesn't matter, as if history doesn't even exist. So, of course, when you're looking at Iran, as you mentioned, you have to talk about the CIA orchestrated coup in 1953 that overthrew the elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, on behalf of oil companies, on the Anglo-Iranian oil company, which became British Petroleum, BP. And the situation in Latin America is very similar. Of course, in 1823, the US government declares Latin America to be part of its own neo-colonial sphere of influence in the Monroe Doctrine. And really, when we're talking about US foreign policy in Latin America, we can't take it out of that context. These past 200 years, in which the U.S. has really seen Latin America as its own backyard. And what's really shocking, in fact, is just recently Bill Maher, the major U.S. pundit who has a show on HBO, people call him a cruise missile liberal because he's a very hawkish liberal who supports every war. He said this very explicitly. He used explicitly neo-colonial rhetoric. He just did an interview with Ann Coulter, who is a white nationalist Trump supporter. And in that interview, Bill Maher said explicitly he endorsed the U.S.-backed coup in Venezuela, which I'll talk about. And he said, "This is our backyard, Monroe Doctrine." And that shows the neo-colonial perspective right there. For 200 years, the U.S. has seen these countries as part of its sphere of influence. And that's why when you have an independent socialist government like Cuba, like Bolivia, and of course, like Venezuela, as we'll see, then the U.S. is terrified for the potential of what that can mean. And to talk about the situation in Venezuela, we don't actually need to go back that far, but it's important to understand that in the past 200 years, there's this neo-colonial history. And in the past 100 years, throughout the Cold War and still today, the U.S. has orchestrated dozens of coups, has overthrown numerous democratically elected governments in Chile and in Venezuela once before. And throughout the region in Guatemala. So getting back to the current situation in Venezuela, a lot of this really starts in 1998. And in 1998, you have the rise of this new figure in politics, Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez comes from the military, and he was a very popular working class politician who came from the barrios, who could relate to working class Venezuelans. He wasn't just part of the elite. And throughout much of the Cold War and until the 1950s, Venezuela had a military dictatorship. And then throughout much of the Cold War, it had a kind of right-wing oligarchic government just controlled by plutocrats. And he came along and said, no, we're going to use the oil wealth in Venezuela. And Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. more than Saudi Arabia.
This
and he
is
said,
very
we're going
similar. This is, sorry to cut you off, this is very similar to Mossadegh in Iran, isn't it?
extremely similar. Mossadegh and many other, Mossadegh was not a communist, and Hugo Chavez was not a communist. Hugo Chavez was a socialist, absolutely. And Mossadegh was not even, I mean, he was kind of left-leaning, certainly progressive, social democratic, but these people aren't even necessarily Marxist-Leninists. They're just nationalists who want to use the natural resources of their country to benefit the working class of their own country.
Yeah, and
but of course,
if I remember right, the CIA coup, Operation Ajax in 1953 in Iran, the way they actually started it is with spreading rumours on the ground that Mossadegh was a Jewish communist, they labelled him?
I'm not sure about Jewish.
I think it was Jewish communist, the CIA. Sorry, you continue.
I mean, there you go. It says that the far right. I mean, the CIA, by the way, after World War II, the CIA rehabilitated all of these former fascist and former Nazi collaborators and was preparing in case there was a war of the Soviet Union. The U.S. was going to reactivate. The CIA was going to reactivate all of these former fascist assets. But anyway, that's called Operation Gladio, by the way. There's some good research on that. But anyway. So yeah, going back to Iran, the U.S. falsely claimed that Mossadegh was a communist, and in fact, the reality is that Mossadegh had cracked down a bit, not as much as the monarchy, but cracked down a bit on the communist movement. Iran had one of the largest communist parties in the entire world, and it was called the Tudeh Party. And Mossadegh was certainly not pro-communist, but anyone who, like, also a year later in Guatemala in 1954, anyone who wanted to use their natural resources to benefit their own working class was portrayed as a communist by the U.S., and that was used to justify overthrowing them. In 1954 in Guatemala, Arbenz, who was the elected president there, he was definitely not a communist. A similar situation with Mossadegh. He kind of repressed the communist movement locally, but Arbenz, the Guatemalan president, wanted to nationalize some of the land and redistribute the land because basically all of it was controlled by U.S. corporations and specifically the United Fruit Company. So we see the same story again and again. In Venezuela, it's very clear because Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, larger than even Saudi Arabia, larger than Iran.
297 billion barrels of oil. There's the 297 billion reasons for this happening.
Exactly.
None of them are anything to do with human rights, by the way.
None. And there are others too, which we'll get to. But and so I don't want to have a deterministic view of it's not always just oil. So in the case of Guatemala, it was the land, the very fertile land. It was the fruit. I mean, also just frankly, bananas. It's how you get cheap bananas is basically.
It's resources, isn't it?
It's very often natural resources. But in the case of Iran and Venezuela, it was very clearly oil. And in Venezuela, the situation, it's just so blatant. In fact, I just published an article at the Gray Zone, which I help edit with Max Blumenthal. And in it, I show how immediately, and I'll get to some of the details about what's going on with Maduro, the current president of Venezuela, but the so-called interim president, who's the coup leader that the United States has tried to install, Britain has also moved to recognizing this leader. His name's Juan Guaido, and he was not elected. He's a young 35-year-old who's barely known. In fact, a recent poll from early January found that 81% of Venezuelans didn't even know who this guy is. And the U.S. and other countries decided that they're going to just appoint him the so-called president, this coup leader, and immediately, within 48 hours, he immediately moved to try to restructure Venezuela's state-owned oil company, the PDVSA, and specifically its largest foreign-owned asset, Venezuela's largest foreign-owned asset, which is Citgo. Citgo is the U.S.-based Venezuelan oil refiner. It's based in the U.S., largely in Texas, also in Illinois, and Venezuela owns it. The Venezuela's state-owned oil company owns Citgo, and immediately, within 48 hours, the coup leader is trying to fire the directors of Citgo and reappoint his own directors, and he's also trying to pass what he calls a hydrocarbons law and create a hydrocarbons agency that would provide low bid contracts for U.S. and other Western multinational corporations. It's just, they spell it out so obviously.
They're not even hiding it, are they? I mean, this guy is apparently hunkered down in the Colombian embassy, I believe, in Venezuela at the moment. And he's issuing decrees left, right, and centre. And at the same time as Venezuela is under crippling sanctions from the West, Western countries that are comparable to Nicaragua in the 80s, I believe. He's also sent a letter to the United States government requesting aid, which is, I think, the height of hypocrisy. But I'm sorry, carry on.
No, absolutely. And you hit the nail on the head when you talked about this obsession with supposed Russian interference. We still don't have any evidence of this. In fact, on ABC recently, Jonathan Karl, who is a centrist, pro-establishment ABC News White House correspondent, even he recently acknowledged that Robert Mueller, the FBI special counsel, doesn't really have anything in his report because it's a boogeyman that's being used to distract from all of
anything. If there was anything there, it would have been leaked.
Yeah, 2 years ago.
And if there was anything there, they would have known immediately because they would have had the evidence. They know where the internet traffic goes. They have 2 points in those transatlantic cables they can monitor. They would know exactly when it was done, exactly what time, who it was from, which building, everything, and they haven't leaked that. I honestly could talk to you about Russiagate forever. I've been following it since the very beginning.
Well, and of course, I'm sure your viewers know my colleague Aaron Mate, who is
absolutely the buzzsaw.
Yeah, but but anyway, the point is that we keep hearing this obsession, and it's like, okay, yeah, Trump is certainly a corrupt oligarch. I don't doubt, he was trying to build some real estate in Russia, but the only so-called evidence that we've been presented so far is these so-called Facebook ads that maybe were sponsored by this Russian internet research agency. But even Facebook admitted that 56% of those supposed Russian ads came out after the election. And also 25% of the ads were never seen by anyone. And
25% of the ads left were in deep red states as well, which would not have affected the outcome at all. It really is preposterous. I talked about this a while because I used to be in internet marketing. I've talked about it a bit. That's sort of how I got interested in politics, because I was an internet marketer. I was in contact with other internet marketers, and they were using their bots on Facebook to promote full stories. I was using it for a different thing, and mine was all legit. But I had 850 bot Facebook accounts. Essentially, I personally had, me and a partner I was doing it with, had more Facebook bot accounts than the entire Russian troll farm that Mueller indicted. So that just goes to show how much they have blown this all up out of proportion. To get back to Venezuela, though, we must get back to point. Honestly, I could talk to you all day about Russiagate. I really could.
No, but this is the point that we're trying to make, is that there's this constant obsession, not even just in the U.S., even it's come into the U.K. a little bit as well. And there's this obsession. Meanwhile, while everyone's talking about supposed Russian Facebook ads, the U.S. and its allies are not only rubber stamping a coup in Venezuela, they're leading the coup. The Wall Street Journal published a report that talked about how the U.S. and its allies for months were orchestrating this coup attempt. And the day before Juan Guaido, or 2 days before Juan Guaido declared himself supposed interim president, he got a call from Mike Pence, the U.S. vice president, who told him, "We support you." And we also saw a report that Chrystia Freeland, the Canadian foreign affairs minister, also told Juan Guaido 2 weeks before he declared himself supposed interim president that Canada was going to support him and applauded him for uniting the Venezuelan opposition.
Yeah, this is not them backing a coup. This is them leading it, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. So again, we need to look at the parallel between the rhetoric we hear about Russia and what's actually happening. So now I'll talk a bit more about Hugo Chavez, the Bolivarian Revolution, why the U.S. is doing this. Because I mentioned that a lot of this goes back really until 1998. In 1998, Hugo Chavez, this socialist firebrand, is elected president in a free and fair election. In 1999, in a democratic referendum, they vote to rewrite the Constitution and to create a progressive socialist constitution.
This Constitution is awesome. It's awesome.
Amazing.
They have
Amazing.
the right to vote in their constitution, and because it's in there, they therefore have to make it extremely legal for people to actually identify themselves at the voting booths, because it's not as if you can just walk in and vote. You have to put your thumbprint there, you have to then get a printout and then put it in the ballot box. After the ballot is finished, I think it's 52% of all the ballot boxes are tallied up in. It's awesome. It's unriggable. It's unhackable. And I've done a video about this before and looked at it and just thought, I want that system here. And we've got a pretty good electoral system. We still go on the paper ballots. Lord knows what people like you in America must think looking at this.
Yeah, where we use digital voting systems that are all controlled by a small handful of companies, which is it's the American way, is let some companies monopolize this very important market based on voting. Because voting is now a market to make money on. Anyway, the point is that you had the constitutional referendum in 1999, and then another presidential election in 2000 in Venezuela. So that's 2 presidential elections in 2 years. Hugo Chavez won them both. They were very free and fair. They were so free and fair, in fact, that the Carter Center, which was founded by the former U.S. President Jimmy Carter to monitor elections across the planet, the Carter Center monitored the 98 and 2000 elections and said they were the best elections they had observed in the entire world, that Venezuela had the best electoral process in the world. So Hugo Chavez, where we hear, oh, he was a dictator. He won 6 elections and referenda from 1998 until he died in 2013. They were all free and fair. International observers said so. And those years were the kind of peak of the Bolivarian Revolution. We saw a massive increase in public spending and social services. Poverty drastically was reduced.
Yeah, let me just hold you there, because I think you just skipped over something that I thought was really important, because people say that it was disastrous the way the Venezuelan economy has fell. Now, I've looked into this, and maybe you can put me straight if I'm wrong, but from what I can tell, the oil reserves in Venezuela are actually slightly different to, normal oil drilling wells like there would be in Saudi Arabia. These are tar sands that are very similar to Alberta, Canada, if I believe. And that is more expensive to extract. So for them to actually be viable, they need to be selling that at somewhere around about $80 per barrel. Now, in the early 2000s, the price of oil was about $30 per barrel, but then it spiked during the end of the decade and went to over 100. So for those few years, oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela and Canada, they made out like bandits and did really well. Now, from what I can tell, Saudi Arabia have done this. They've been down this road before. They've been through the good times and the bad. So what they did was they maybe spent 25% of the money on the economy and then invested the other 3/4 elsewhere, and then sort of used their oil reserves as a rainy day fund. Now, from what I can tell, Maduro didn't do that. However, it wasn't like he did anything corrupt. What he did was he spent it all on the people. And I've got some stats, actually, that I picked up. What he did and it transformed the country, didn't it? With him spent, I know it was a mistake him doing it. And when fracking led to the price of oil actually coming back down, all of a sudden they're in trouble. But they got a hell of a lot out of it, didn't they?
Absolutely. There's a few things to mention there. It wasn't just fracking. Of course, Obama also drastically increased oil production, and he recently boasted of that at this meeting with Jim Baker, the former Reagan and Bush senior official, this top Republican. Obama gave a speech with him, and in this, Obama won. He bragged of boosting U.S. oil production and making the U.S. the world's largest oil exporter.
I've seen it.
And also in that same speech, he said, Wall Street executives say I'm anti-Wall Street. Well, look where their revenue was before I entered, and now look at it, and they should be thanking me. Yeah. So anyway, that's Obama for you. But another point to mention in response to oil prices is that it's actually, some analysts have suggested that this was an intentional political strategy, that the U.S. was encouraging, pressuring, even forcing Saudi Arabia to overproduce oil, because of course when you flood the market with oil, that drops the price. And by doing so, because Saudi Arabia was really overproducing oil for years, and to an extent still is, which kept the price of oil very low. And of course, that hurt the oil-based economies that are like the official enemies of the US. So you mentioned Iran, of course, Russia, and then finally Venezuela. All of those countries, when the price of oil dropped in 2014 specifically, there was a massive plummet in the price of oil, and it's still pretty low.
If
All of their
if that was manufactured, I haven't got words for how Machiavellian that is.
Well, I mean, saying it's manufactured gives it a kind of air of mystery. No, it's just economic warfare.
Yeah.
And that's also why OPEC was originally created, is to be able to control the price of oil. And what's interesting now, in Venezuela, in OPEC, Venezuela was always a moderate until Hugo Chavez. And Chavez began exercising more Venezuelan influence inside OPEC. And in the past few years, we've seen negotiations at OPEC and what they call OPEC Plus, which is OPEC plus Russia. And there has been a fight, actually, where the U.S., Donald Trump administration, is continuing to pressure to keep the price of oil low, whereas Venezuela and Iran have been trying to decrease production so they can raise the price of oil, because obviously it will help their economies. So it's not saying that it was orchestrated kind of implies that there's some kind of cabal. Actually, it's much more mundane. It's just that this is how international capital works. This is how the capitalist system
I call it Machiavellian. They will call it everyday business, won't they?
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that the reality is that the banality of evil can apply just as much to capitalism. That this stuff is actually pretty mundane, and people on Wall Street, they're just looking at numbers, and that's all they care about. And for the U.S., low oil prices is a good thing. For many other countries, high oil prices is a good thing. So yeah, now, I mean, you raised a good point.
So the price of oil drops, but Chavez has invested obviously all this money that he's made from this oil, because the oil's been nationalized, into the economy. How does that affect the people? I mean, I've read some stats and it's incredible. I mean, the one stat I read was 30% of youngsters were enrolling in college in 2000, and 8 years or 9 years later, that was over 70%. I think life expectancy increased 2 years. Was the infant mortality dropped to some unbelievable amount? It was incredible, wasn't it? The transformation.
Absolutely incredible. So incredible that even these international financial institutions like the World Bank, which exist to exercise U.S. influence in the global South, and which have crushed independent governments with debt and forced neoliberal austerity measures, even they acknowledged that in Venezuela, the standard of living drastically improved, infant mortality rates dropped, poverty was cut by over half, extreme poverty was drastically reduced. All of these measures.
Unemployment went from 24 to 7%, I heard, something like that.
Yeah, it was massively reduced. And a lot of it was through the state sector and through the creation of these communal organizations. And it's not all just top-down stuff. There's also bottom-down, community-oriented institutions. So you created these Bolivarian, it was called the Bolivarian Revolution, these Bolivarian communal institutions where you would have a local health clinic and even music groups and literary and artistic groups and cultural groups and health. I mentioned like health clinics, especially in the barrios and these poor areas in Venezuela. You had poor people who had never gone to the doctor and never gone to the dentist, and they now have local doctors and dentists who can provide support for them that's funded by the state. A massive increase in all of these forms of social investment and education. Also another rate that's important to look at is illiteracy, which also massively went down.
Yes, that was the other one.
A massive investment in education for poor people who did not have a formal education in some instances. So even these neoliberal institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, which Hugo Chavez kicked out of Venezuela, by the way, because he wanted to encourage his own form of South-South integration and cooperation, even they had to acknowledge the undeniable fact that the standard of living for the average Venezuelan drastically was increased in those years. And it's become more difficult since then, and we can talk about that. But there's no question that for the average working class Venezuelan, the Bolivarian Revolution has made their life much easier and better, which is why they still support the government despite its mistakes.
So that covers Chavez from '98 through to 2014. Now, during that time, there was also attempted coups. He was at gunpoint from the Americans at one stage, wasn't he, Chavez, in 2002?
Yes, in April 2002, there was not only an attempted coup, a briefly successful coup. In April 2002, the military overthrew Chavez and replaced him with an oligarch named Carmona. And what's interesting about this is, like this current leader, Guaido, Carmona was very little known. He was just a plutocrat, a businessman, they called him, who was installed. The U.S. immediately recognized him, along with other Western countries. What's fascinating, though, about that coup is that, unlike this current coup attempt, which I'll talk about, this is not a military coup right now going on in Venezuela, because Guaido does not have the military behind him. The military still supports the legitimate government.
Put a pin in that. I'll come to that at the very end. That's my last question, so put a pin in that. That's the important question, I think.
Absolutely.
So
well, then in 2002,
carry
the
on.
military overthrew Chavez, but Chavez was so popular that, and this leader Pedro Carmona was so unpopular that the masses of Venezuelan people actually went out into the streets. They rose up and they demanded that the military reinstall Hugo Chavez, their elected leader. And the military once again rose up, ousted the unelected coup leader, Pedro Carmona, and replaced him once again with Hugo Chavez, who, I stress, won 2 presidential elections in the previous years. He was democratically elected, and the U.S. government, we now know, it's been reported by mainstream outlets, including the vehemently anti-Maduro, anti-Chavez newspaper, The Guardian, even The Guardian, which has been supporting their most recent coup attempt, even they had to acknowledge that the George Bush administration had its hands all over the 2002 coup. The CIA was involved in that. This has all been acknowledged by mainstream media outlets. So when we're hearing about what's going on now, we keep hearing, oh, the U.S. and these other countries are doing this for freedom and democracy and to fight authoritarianism. No, they have never been interested in that in the history of Latin America, and especially in Venezuela, considering back in 2002, the democratically elected leader who was recognized by the entire international community, they overthrew Hugo Chavez then, and they're doing the same thing now.
So, I mean, just recently, our country blocked Venezuela from getting $1.4 billion worth of gold out of the Bank of England. I think that was 2 days ago. So, I mean, this has all happened really quite quickly. Now, what I want to get to is, I mean, if there's nothing pertinent really with regards to the last few years, obviously Maduro, his approval rating isn't great because they are facing an economic crisis. However, this Guaido, his approval rating is very similar, I believe, and also he's probably got about 1/5 of the support or something like that. So the question really I want to ask you is, I mean, this is an obvious coup. This is been done with the media's, with their approval of it and their support, without the military or large fractions of the military. I believe Maduro wasn't a high level, it was sort of a bunch of mid-level, sorry, not Maduro, Chavez was a bunch of mid-level ranking officers that sort of overthrew his coup back in the 90s. Can it work without the military? This is what I wanted to touch on the end. I think we've covered pretty much, what is going on there. Can it work? I don't know, you see. This is why I'm asking.
That's the question. And I do want to answer that question. But before we end, I do want to mention another very important piece of historical context. So to answer your question briefly, it's unclear. The impression is that the military officer corps is with Maduro and the legitimate government of Venezuela. Now, the Wall Street Journal has reported that the U.S. government, they quoted these U.S. officials from the top Trump administration officials who implied that they're trying to use a strategy similar to Syria, where they're encouraging rank and file members of the military to defect and to support the opposition and their illegitimate coup government. And that's, of course, what happened in Syria, where you had this so-called Free Syrian Army, which didn't really exist. It was more of a media creation, but you did have some people defect from the military, although it wasn't mostly officers. So we could see that happen in Venezuela, which is very, very dangerous. And we can't overstate how dangerous this is, because it could put Venezuela on the path toward a civil war like we saw in Syria. And it's terrifying because, frankly, it looks to me like that could be the U.S. policy, is to create another Syria inside Venezuela, also similar to Libya in 2011. Even if there's not direct U.S. military intervention, there could be this kind of proxy war waged. And it would be similar to the war in Syria, which devastated the country, killed hundreds of thousands of people, made all these refugees. So we can't overstate how dangerous that is. But one other thing before we end here that I want to talk about, and that's that, let's talk really quickly. Hugo Chavez died in 2013. And certainly because of the oil prices, because of some mistakes from the government, and because of relentless economic warfare internally from the opposition of Venezuela and from the capitalist class, and also from economic warfare from the US and sanctions, all of these things combined, internal contradictions and mistakes and external repression, they have all combined to create what's indisputably certainly an economic crisis going on in Venezuela. There's massive inflation, some goods are lacking. But of course, the impression that we get from reading the corporate media is that this is all it's all because of the Maduro regime, blah, blah, blah. He's unelected. That's all completely false. And I want to really unpack here quickly the historical context to understand this narrative that supposedly Venezuela is an authoritarian regime. And this is the narrative that's used to justify replacing Maduro with Guaido, because they say Maduro is not legitimate. No, that's absolutely false. Maduro is still legitimate. So in 2013, Hugo Chavez died, and they had a presidential election. And Maduro won that election fair and square. It was recognized by international institutions and observers to be a fair election. He won against this opposition leader, Enrique Capriles. And at first, Capriles said, "Oh, this was an unfair election," but then he later conceded that Maduro won the election. So what happened after that is the price of oil dropped, and they began having economic problems. And when the price of oil dropped, as you know, it plummeted. It didn't just drop slowly; it plummeted.
It went. I think over 2/3 it dropped. It went from $100 down to 30 or something ridiculous, and then it went back up to 50, I believe.
Yeah, in a span of like weeks, it was very quick, and this was largely in 2014. So Venezuela, one of the mistakes of the Bolivarian Revolution, which you acknowledged earlier, is that 95% of Venezuela's exports are oil or petroleum based, and 25% of the entire country's GDP is based on oil. So this is really a petro state. Like Saudi Arabia and like other countries, it really heavily depends on the oil industry. So when you have the price of oil fluctuate so drastically, it can really hurt the economy, and that's what happened. Now, in response to that, the opposition began exploiting this unrest, and there were legitimate protests, but then there were also violent protests. It's like what happened.
Which year was this? Was this 2016 or 2015?
There were two major rounds of protests. There have been protests throughout, but the two serious, violent rounds of protests were 2014 and 2017. So
okay, the 2017 one, I watched Abby Martin's great report with Mike Preisner. She was on the front lines and actually got tear gassed at one stage, and she was talking about how these, I think they call them guarimbas, don't they?
Guarimbas.
And they were antagonizing the military, a military state, and throwing rocks and petrol bombs and setting cars on fire in order to actually get the military to come out to actually then engage them, and then get pictures of the military obviously retaliating, so that then it can be repeated on Western media. So I was well aware from 2017 onwards, but you said there was two. There was one in 2014 as well.
Absolutely. And you hit the nail on the head. This is an important point. It's actually very similar to what happened in Syria. Of course, there were legitimate protests in Syria, but then there were also people who were inciting violence, burning down government buildings, attacking police, because they want to encourage the violent crackdown, so then they can justify foreign military intervention.
Which Assad, of course, did.
Yeah, and in Venezuela, that was the strategy. And The government has been smarter. In Syria, they just cracked down,
Yeah.
and then immediately the weapons started flowing in. So in that case, the strategy worked. In Venezuela, Maduro has been smarter, and he's understood the strategy, and he's walked a fine line. You can't crack down too much because then it will justify foreign intervention. They'll broadcast all of this footage in the international media as propaganda. But of course, so there were peaceful protests, but there were a lot of violent protests going on. You mentioned the guarimbas. This is also similar to what happened in Nicaragua in 2018, in mid-2018, where you had these right-wing opposition figures would go out in the streets, and they would just make these barricades and set things on fire and prevent average people, not only police, not only politicians, but prevent average people from using roads. And they would just take over roads and neighborhoods and then say that this belongs to us now. In Nicaragua, it was more successful because it's a small country with a much weaker central state. And of course, the situation is similar in Venezuela. Now, what's also happened at the same time, which was even more extreme in Venezuela, was that, so you had these protests in 2014. In 2017, you had another round of protests that were even more explicitly violent. And in this case, you had people bombing police. There are videos of them literally bombing police. You had also people, opposition figures, who were burning down PSUV, that's the Venezuelan Socialist Party, the United Socialist Party of Maduro and Chavez, burning down their offices.
Set a guy on fire as well, didn't they?
Burning Chavistas, especially dark-skinned, black and dark-skinned Venezuelans, because, as I mentioned, Hugo Chavez and Maduro come out of the working class from the barrios. Maduro was a bus driver, and they're also much darker skinned. And you'll see the opposition is much lighter skinned because, the middle class and the upper class tends to be, lighter and more European. And they'll even use like racist rhetoric against Chavez and Maduro. So some of these far-right opposition figures were burning Chavistas and laughing. And in 2017, in June, a very important event happened that the corporate media outlets never acknowledge, and that was a violent attack on the Supreme Court by this Venezuelan police agent named Oscar Perez, where he hijacked a helicopter from the military, and then he flew to the Supreme Court and attacked the Supreme Court with grenades. And then
wow, I don't remember that.
And then there's video of it. And then opposition figures set this building that was connected to the Supreme Court. They were trying to burn down the Supreme Court, but they couldn't get in the Supreme Court. So there was this building in front of it. They burned it down. They set it on fire. So,
I'm watching that as soon as this ends.
Yeah, you should show that clip in here. And what's so wild is not only did that happen, but first, immediately the response was like the Washington Post and these outlets implied it was a false flag operation. And then when they found out that actually it was an opposition figure, because he was a far-right Christian extremist who released this video, Oscar Perez, where he was dressed like ISIS with all these people with masks on. And he was like, it was like this really weird Christian fundamentalist thing. And he was talking about God supports us in our quest, blah, blah, blah. And he made it clear he was the opposition. So then people were like, oh man, we can't claim this as a false flag. So then what they did was they whitewashed him. And numerous media outlets, including Newsweek, they compared him to James Bond. They called him the Venezuelan James Bond. This is a guy who attacked the Supreme Court with grenades and a helicopter. Yeah. So we need to understand that certainly there have been protests, but then there also have been violent attacks to try to destabilize the government, not just economic war, literal warfare. And a lot of this has been to try to encourage foreign intervention, because that has been the goal. One final note here. The opposition knows that it's very unpopular. You mentioned that I'm not going to pretend like Maduro is super popular. His approval ratings are pretty low. They're in like the 30-something percentile rating, which, by the way, not to compare him in any way.
Macron would kill for those figures, by the way, at the moment.
Yeah. Exactly. What I was going to say is, not to compare in any way, they're very different. And Trump is a billionaire in chief. He has a different support base. But Trump's approval rating is 34% or something. So does that mean we should overthrow Trump and we should recognize Nancy Pelosi?
Macron's is at 17. Should we recognize Le Pen as the president? Should we?
Exactly. I mean... Exactly. Yeah, and has unrest in the streets. Well, before I want to make a final note here. So the important thing to point out is that this idea is that Maduro was unelected, blah, blah, blah. Well, what happened was in 2015, the National Assembly, which is Venezuela's unicameral Congress, their parliament, they had an election. They had parliamentary elections, and the opposition, this coalition group called the Democratic Unity Roundtable, MUD, they won that election fair and square, and the opposition took control of the National Assembly. We keep hearing that Venezuela's a dictatorship. Well, the opposition won the National Assembly, and they took over fair and square. And immediately, the opposition began declaring like this kind of internal war to try to undermine and destabilize at that point Maduro. And it's actually similar, I think, to what could potentially happen if Jeremy Corbyn is prime minister, who wins a fair election, and then all these state institutions begin trying to overthrow him at every turn and declaring war against him.
They already are, mate. You and I both know that. Mr. Integrity Initiative, they already are.
Yeah, there's this famous Channel 4 movie series or TV series, A Very British Coup. And that could be also a very real possibility that could happen in the United Kingdom. Well, of course, that's what's been happening in Venezuela. The opposition took control of the National Assembly and began waging war to oust Maduro. And there began a war between the Supreme Court, which had a lot of pro-Maduro people, and the opposition-held National Assembly, and they began kind of waging political warfare. And the opposition-controlled National Assembly began defying Supreme Court rulings intentionally and buying votes, and there was all this corruption. And so what happened was that there were massive protests again. And in July 2017, after the violent attacks on the Supreme Court and other institutions, there was an election for the Constituent Assembly. And the idea that Maduro had was, we'll have a Constituent Assembly which is democratically elected, and will bring people together, and we'll write a new constitution and try to have these. There were peace talks between the opposition and the government in 2016 that was sponsored by the Vatican. The opposition walked away from those at every turn. So Maduro said, okay, we'll have this election for the Constituent Assembly and try to bring everyone together. The opposition boycotted the 2017 election, and they said that they refused to recognize the Constituent Assembly. So what happened was that you have two parallel Congresses running, essentially parliaments running. You have the National Assembly controlled by the opposition, which was defying Supreme Court rulings and refused to recognize the Constituent Assembly. And then the Constituent Assembly, which was full of Maduro supporters because they're the ones who ran on elections because the opposition boycotted it. And that's why the opposition claims that the government is illegitimate, because the opposition has boycotted these elections and refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of these state institutions, because they've been trying to construct their own parallel state within the legitimate Venezuelan state, which is why in May of 2018, they refused to participate in the presidential election. The mainstream opposition boycotted the 2018 election. So it was a fair election. Maduro won, but the opposition boycotted it, so they say it's not legitimate. That's how we get to where we are today. The opposition wants to have its cake and eat it too. They claim Venezuela is no longer a democracy and it's an authoritarian regime, but they refuse to participate in democratic process.
That's the situation we're in. Ben, before you, I just want one last thing. There is one last thing we need to touch on, because there's a guy that we haven't talked about, and he's just been appointed, I think, envoy to Venezuela. He's going to oversee this whole mess for Donald Trump, and his name is Elliott Abrams. And this guy is some piece of work, isn't he, Ben?
Yeah, Elliott Abrams is the arch neocon. I mean, he really is. When you think of what neoconservatism is, he is an embodiment of that. Up there with Marco Rubio, with these kinds of figures. I mean, he does not pretend in any way to be, a humanitarian. The Obama administration pushed this kind of neoliberal R2P, right to protect humanitarianism. Elliott Abrams is a straight up unreconstructed neocon. Throughout the Reagan administration, he was a mastermind of the dirty wars inside Central America, specifically in Nicaragua and El Salvador, where the U.S. government backed far-right death squads that massacred civilians, labor organizers, killed, teachers and average working class people in a campaign of terror to destabilize the leftist governments there. Elliott Abrams was closely involved in all of that. He also was deeply implicated in the Iran-Contra scandal.
Contra, yeah.
And in fact, he would have faced repercussions for it, but he was really just slapped on the wrist thanks to the Reagan administration. And then Bush Sr. absolved him, pardoned him of all of the few, he was fined like $50 or something. It was absurd. So not only that, though, Elliott Abrams also helped orchestrate the 2002 coup in Venezuela. So this is a very clear sign of what the Trump administration's priorities are. And more than that, the most egregious series of crimes that Elliott Abrams has been implicated in is that he, along with the U.S. government, it's not certainly just him, but the U.S. government strongly supported Guatemala's brutal dictator Rios Montt as he carried out a literal campaign of genocide. The United Nations recognized it as literal genocide in Guatemala against the Maya population. Rios Montt, the U.S.-backed Guatemalan military dictator, he massacred Maya indigenous Guatemalans because they were sympathetic to the socialist movement. And it was part of this larger anti-communist war. And Elliott Abrams was directly involved in that. He is a literal war criminal, not just in the sense of, he's overseeing these horrible atrocities. He's an actual war criminal who oversaw a previous coup in Venezuela. And now the Trump administration has appointed him special envoy to Venezuela, and he will be working with former CIA director turned Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and another arch neocon, John Bolton.
This is not good for Venezuela. Well, Ben, I will be covering this as in-depth as I can. I know you will too. Please tell my viewers, because my viewers are predominantly in the UK, so I assume that some of them won't be aware of you. Please let us know where they can find you, and I'll leave all the links below this video as well.
Absolutely. My name is Ben Norton, as you have heard for the past few minutes, and I help edit this website, The Gray Zone, with Max Blumenthal, who's a colleague of mine.
That's a website I've covered many times on this channel. It is excellent.
Yeah, you can go to grayzoneproject.com. We have a lot of great stuff there we're always working on. And also with Max Blumenthal, I co-host and produce a podcast and a video show. We recently, like you, we've moved more to YouTube because there's a huge audience there. And that's called Moderate Rebels. And it's very political. We also try to have some fun and make some jokes sometimes, because people can be too serious sometimes in politics. Hey, so
we do the news, mate, and the news sucks. It's nice to have a laugh every now and then.
There's a lot to laugh at. Yeah, so you can find my stuff at Moderate Rebels in the Gray Zone.
Thanks very much, Ben. I'll put all the links below, and it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for doing this. I am honestly honored.
Oh, I mean, it was my pleasure. Thanks for letting me rant for an hour.
Are you kidding? It was fantastic.
Yeah, just lovely. Because, I said this in a recent interview, but one of the ways the corporate media really censors opposing views is not just by preventing people with an anti-war perspective from having a platform at all, but even more insidiously is Chomsky talks about how concision is used as a way of opposing alternative viewpoints. Because if you're just repeating what the establishment narrative is, you don't need to provide justification. You don't need to provide a long explanation. But if you're challenging that narrative, you have to be able to have the time and the context. So thanks for letting me bloviate for a bit.
It's a pleasure. That's exactly what I wanted to get you on for, because we need the history before we can actually make a judgment based on, because otherwise we haven't got the facts and the impertinent things, or the pertinent information behind it. And I really appreciate you coming on and letting us know all about it.
Of course.
Thanks
Anytime.
very much, Ben.
Thanks for having me.
To support truly honest, independent journalism like this, please go to patreon.com/Gordon Dimmack. You can become a patron of mine for as little as $1 a month, and every dollar helps. I cannot stress that enough. We can't do this without you. Also, you can use any of the avenues on your screen right now to donate, or below. There are many of them. Please make sure you're subscribed. They unsubscribe people every day, so please make sure you are, and click that bell as well so you get a notification of when I drop further videos. Thanks very much for your support. Until next time, peace and take care.